By the mid-17th century, England was no longer a stable kingdom. It was a system under tension. At the centre of that tension stood Charles I of England, a monarch who believed deeply in the authority of the crown. His position was not simply political. It was ideological. He saw kingship as something granted by divine right, not negotiated through agreement. To him, authority flowed from the top, not from institutions or assemblies. This belief placed him in direct conflict with another force that had been growing in influence: Parliament. What had once been an advisory body was becoming something more assertive. It demanded participation in decisions, especially those involving taxation and governance. It questioned royal authority, not in theory, but in practice. And for Charles, this was not a disagreement. It was a challenge. The conflict did not begin with violence. It began with resistance. Charles ruled without Parliament for years, attempting to maintain control through alternative methods of raising revenue. These methods were legally questionable, but they allowed him to operate without interference. For a time, the system held. But pressure builds, and eventually it forces change. When financial strain increased, Charles was compelled to recall Parliament. What followed was not cooperation. It was confrontation. Parliament no longer accepted a limited role. It sought to define the terms of governance, to restrict the power of the crown, to create a system where authority was shared. Charles refused. The divide widened. Positions hardened. Trust collapsed. What had once been a political disagreement became something else entirely, a structural conflict. And once a system reaches that point, resolution becomes difficult, because compromise requires both sides to accept limits, and neither side was willing to do that. The result was inevitable: war. When the conflict turned into open war, neither side believed it would last. Supporters of Charles I of England saw the outcome as a matter of time. The king still held symbolic authority, loyal nobles, and a network of traditional support that had defined the English system for generations. In their view, resistance from Parliament was temporary, an overreach that would collapse once confronted with force. On the other side, Parliament did not see itself as a rebellion. It saw itself as a correction. Its leaders argued that they were not fighting against the monarchy, but against the misuse of it. They believed the system could be rebalanced without removing the king entirely. Authority would be limited, not eliminated. At least, that was the assumption. The early phases of the war reflected this uncertainty. Engagements were inconsistent. Strategies were evolving. Neither side held a decisive advantage. But as the conflict continued, something began to change, not in ideology, but in organization. Parliament adapted faster. It restructured its forces, placing greater emphasis on discipline, coordination, and centralized command. This led to the creation of a more effective military structure, most notably the new model army, an organized force that operated with a level of consistency that the royalist side struggled to match. This shift mattered, because wars are not won by intention. They are won by execution. As the new model army gained momentum, the balance began to tilt. Royalist forces, once confident, were forced into reactive positions. Their movements became defensive. Their options narrowed, and with each engagement, the possibility of a decisive royal victory moved further away. For Charles, the situation became increasingly complex. He was no longer directing a system that operated smoothly. He was managing a fragmented force under pressure. Communication became more difficult. Coordination weakened, and as the military situation deteriorated, the political position of the crown weakened with it. Eventually, the outcome became clear. The king could not win. But even at that point, the assumption remained that the system itself would survive, that the monarchy would continue, even if altered. What no one fully understood was how far the consequences would go. After the war, the king was no longer a distant authority. He was a prisoner. For many within Parliament, this was enough. The objective had been achieved. The king's power had been reduced. The system could now be restructured. Negotiations could define the future. The monarchy could be limited, controlled, and integrated into a new political balance. But not everyone agreed. Within Parliament and the army, divisions began to emerge. Some believed that compromise was still possible. Others believed that the existence of the king, any king with the same ideology, would always represent a threat to the system they were trying to build. At the center of this tension was a growing realization. Charles was not changing. Even in captivity, he continued to negotiate, to communicate, to attempt to regain leverage. He engaged with different factions, exploring opportunities to restore his position. To his supporters, this was resilience. To his opponents, it was confirmation. Confirmation that the conflict was not over, that the same struggle would continue if he remained. This shifted the question from how to control the king to whether he could be allowed to remain at all. The idea of trying a monarch for treason was unprecedented. Kings were not subject to the system. They defined it. But the circumstances had already broken that assumption. War had redefined authority. Now, the system was being asked to take another step, one that could not be reversed. The trial began, not as a symbolic act, but as a statement that the structure of power itself had changed. And once that statement was made, the outcome could only go one way. The trial did not follow tradition. It could not, because nothing about the situation was traditional anymore. Charles I of England was brought before a court that did not fully exist within the old system. The authority of the court itself was contested. Many did not recognize it. Some refused to participate. Others saw it as necessary. But regardless of perspective, one fact remained. A king was being judged. Charles did not accept the legitimacy of the trial. He did not argue the details of the charges in the way expected. Instead, he questioned the foundation of the entire process. By what authority, he asked, could a king be tried? If the monarchy defined the system, how could the system judge the monarchy? This was not just a legal argument. It was a structural one, because if the court could not justify its authority, then the trial itself had no basis. But the court did not step back. It moved forward. The charges were presented: tyranny, abuse of power, responsibility for the war that had divided the kingdom. These were not minor accusations. They framed the king not as a ruler who had made mistakes, but as someone who had acted against the very people he was meant to govern. The outcome was already forming, not in a single decision, but through momentum, because once the trial began, reversing it would have meant acknowledging that the entire process was invalid, and by that point too much had been committed. Too many lines had been crossed. The sentence was delivered. Execution. For many, this was unimaginable, not because executions were rare, but because this was different. This was not a noble, not a rebel, not a political opponent. This was the king, and executing a king does more than remove a person. It removes a concept. The execution took place publicly, deliberately. It was meant to be seen, to send a message that authority had shifted, that the system had changed, that the old structure no longer held. But in sending that message, something else happened, something that had not been fully considered. Because once a system crosses a line like that, it does not return to what it was before. The execution ended the king, but it did not end the problem. For those who had supported the decision, the expectation was clear. Remove the source of conflict, and the system could stabilize. Without the king, there would be no central figure to challenge Parliament, no symbolic authority to rally opposition. The structure could be rebuilt on new terms. But systems are not defined only by individuals. They are defined by perception, and perception does not change instantly. The removal of the king created a vacuum, not just of power, but of identity. England had been a monarchy for generations. The system was built around that assumption. Laws, traditions, expectations, all structured with the king at the center. Removing him did not automatically create a stable alternative. It created uncertainty. The new structure that followed, rule without a monarch, did not immediately provide the clarity or stability that had been expected. Authority was centralized differently, but not necessarily more effectively. Decisions still had to be made. Conflicts still existed. And without the traditional framework, those conflicts became harder to manage. The figure who emerged to fill that space, Oliver Cromwell, brought order. But it was a different kind of order, more controlled, more forceful, less aligned with the original idea of restoring balance. For many, this was not what they had expected. They had removed a king to limit power, but the system that followed concentrated it again, in a different form. The monarchy had been eliminated, but the dynamics of control remained, and over time something became clear. The system had not been fixed. It had been transformed. Eventually, the monarchy returned, not identical to what it had been before, but present again, because the structure that had been removed was more deeply embedded than anyone had fully understood. The execution of Charles I did not end monarchy in England. It changed how it would exist, and it demonstrated something critical, that removing a single figure does not resolve a structural conflict. It reshapes it, in ways that are not always predictable.